Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. And today we're going to talk about math and poetry. Me and poetry go way back, and it's awesome. And here's the thing about it, it's very mathematical. And if you didn't know that, let's get into it. And if you did know that, let's still get into it. It's fun to talk about for me, and I hope you as well. So with poetry, what I like about it before I get into what I want to get into is that it can be beautiful. It can make a point. It can be an outlet. It can do all these things all at the same time if you let it. And here's the thing. For me, it is such a beautiful example of how math and art cannot be divorced. And I've said that once, I've said that twice, I've said that 367 times at least, and I'll say it a million more if I have to, and probably will. Math and art cannot be divorced, and poetry is a good example of that. And the same with creativity and logic, and emotion and logic. Like, we try to create this false divide in society, and the thing about that is, it's two sides of the same coin. And with poetry, it is something that for a lot of people, it's inherently artistic, but it also has a lot of logic and it has a lot of structure. And having that logic, having that structure does not necessarily restrict you. It can help you with your creativity. It can give you a template to go, off of. It can give you a way to channel some things. And when I see poetry, I can't help but see math, right? You start with some letters. You build some words from those letters. You build some lines from those words. You build some stanzas from those lines. And before you know it, you have a poem. And here's the thing about that, right? You have to decide how many words it's going to be, how things are going to flow. And you have so many different elements that are involved in a traditional sense, right? You're considering things like rhythm, you're considering things like meter, you're considering things like flow, and all of these things are mathematical in nature. And you are determining when you write out that poetry how it's going to sound and how it's going to look, right? And you're deciding whether or not you're going to use rhymes or not, because not all poetry use rhymes. Although me personally, I like my rhymes. But that being said, right, you're determining not only how many lines, your poem is going to be, how many words it contains, but also how many syllables, how they flow. And not only are you considering things like I mentioned before, like rhythm, meter, and flow, but you're considering things like cadence, right? And it's all connected, and it all uses math. And then taking things a step further, right? You have different forms of poems, right? Like you have things like sonnets, you have things like haikus, like limericks, and each of these things uses math, right? Oftentimes, right? You'll see different restrictions, but you'll see those restrictions, or so they think, right? You see different structures, and you can play around with the words, but the idea is like you have a certain framework, and if you choose to go in that direction, you can get creative with how you choose to express what you want to express within those frameworks. And with those frameworks, with things like haikus, with things like sonnets, with things like limericks, like they have certain amount of lines, certain amount of rhymes. And with the haiku, in that case, it doesn't actually have rhymes. That one doesn't. But they all have some way to define them, and math is involved across the board. And it can be a challenge if you want to partake in those forms, but you don't have to. That's the thing about poetry, right? You can choose what you want to do, and those are ways to express yourself, and they are rich in culture. And I think that's pretty cool too. And with not having to do one way or another, right? You can always rock it freestyle. And the thing about that is, right, it's still informed by other forms, right? It's informed by what you've learned, and you're still using math along the way. And I think that's really cool. And not only can you take these poems that you've written and roll with it, you can speak them, you can sing them, you can rap them. And each of the things that I just mentioned, there's math in it across the board. Anytime you're dealing with sound, right, you're dealing with volume, you're dealing with frequency, you're dealing with pitch. You're dealing with tone, um, and those things that I mentioned, like the rhythm and the cadence and all that stuff, it gets involved too. And you're dealing with, Valium, and a million other things where math is at its core and how everything is structured. It's a beautiful thing. And I like the idea of like poetry and motion being a thing, because it can be expressive. Because it could just be very strategic motions or dances we traditionally think of it, and I'd argue the former kind of falls into that category of dance, but it's debatable. But either way, there's math in it, right? There's math in the choreography if it's choreographed. There's math in how you're reacting to the environment around you, how you're moving. There's math in that motion. There's math in what's going on in your body. There's math across the board. And back to poetry in a traditional sense, if you are taking your poems and you're selling them, money is now involved, and there's math in that. And if you were to take your poems and you were to collect them, maybe you have an anthology now. You have to decide the amount of poems that are going in, how many pages things are going to go in, and it's popular for some people to keep track of these things via volume, like volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, and these might have parts in them too. And all across the board, whether you realize it or not, you are using math, and that is a beautiful thing. And I like it because again, it's it's two things that you think are disparate, math and art, but they aren't. There's math in art and art in math. And I think if you're going around and you're paying attention to what you're doing, both impact each other, both make you better at the other, and you can't really divorce them. And even if you're not paying attention, you're getting better at both of those things. The more you do them, the more you're exposed to those things, right? And with this world, it's not the same without math. It's not the same without art. And poetry is a beautiful, thing, right? It's a beautiful legacy. One of the finer points of our history, to me. Um, Not all poems are great, but the fact that poetry exists, though, that is. So that being said, I hope you've taken something away from this. That you maybe thought about poetry different, maybe math different, hopefully both. And whatever the case may be, I would like to discuss it. When I'm making these sort of videos, yes, I want to get my ideas across. And when people respond to that and they get what I'm going for, it is great. But I also like the dialogue. And that's not something that I always get. Or, it doesn't always go in depth because people want to be like, I see your point. That's awesome. I see things differently now, but I want to hear more than that. But just to be clear, I want to hear those things. But I want to hear those things in more. And yeah, feel free to check out other videos as well. I will see you in the future in the next one. Professor Prime out.